thinking like if they want to do Q&A, I mean, the 10-minute mark was like, hey, you got to stop. Once we do 5 minutes of Q&A. And that way you can make a time like when they're saying, I don't know. I'm also down for this. Maybe we should do that. But then,
Then it could be the same in 5 minutes. We have to make sure he knows that
it's 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
To the end or
Yeah, let's do it. Let's just do it at like at the end of the session, just look at where you are.
Okay, so this is ends at 10:30 or
Yeah, Stuart and Taylor come to.
That's exactly what I'm from too. We'll see where it goes. Other was two.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to try and get started here. Yep. All right. We're going to kick it off right here in the interest of time. I just want to start by saying good morning, everyone. My name is Lucas Befera. I'm the chair of this conference today. So happy to have everyone here today. This is a sold-out event, and this is, I think, the first time in REF's history. So we are really excited to have everyone here today. This is the 11th annual Rice Energy Finance Summit, and I think for some of our returning attendees, y'all probably know this conference is completely student-run. So that means every one of us who's helping to organize this conference, we're juggling school, internships, recruiting, families, and most recently, new puppies. So a lot going on for our committee. But with that, I did just want to take a second here and ask that the other committee members in the audience just raise their hand. I think y'all deserve some credit. So if you're out there, raise your hand. A round of applause. Excellent. So in January of 2019, I reached out to some of you in the audience, and I asked, would capital discipline still be a relevant topic come November? And people responded. They said, hey, Lucas, this is the energy business. Capital discipline and cost efficiencies are always going to be relevant. Everyone's trying to cut costs. So I was a little hesitant at that point to ask my second question, which was, would y'all be interested in sponsoring this conference on capital discipline? And it really is a testament to the energy industry that despite the cost-cutting regime that's going on, there is no hesitation, and our sponsors still came out to support this conference. And so with that, I just want to thank the sponsors. I'm very grateful for your engagement, and we really appreciate it because that's what makes this conference happen. And your support ultimately helps fund scholarships that educate the future leaders in the energy business. So thank you. What I did want to note that we are in the thick of the Q3 earnings season, so I did do some very unscientific research on FactSet to see if indeed capital discipline was relevant. And it turns out it is very relevant. Indeed, when I control find through transcripts, I find people still say capital discipline. But management teams now are saying value creation more than capital discipline. And I think what we have for y'all today is we have a group of decision makers that are going to be able to tell you exactly what they're doing to create value. And I think that's something we want to focus on. We have a tremendous roster of speakers, and we're so proud of the agenda today. So a thank you to our speakers that are out here today. So thank you all. And as for our attendees, we have over 450 people registered for this event. And we want to create value for you. So what we want to do is we want to make this an opportunity for everybody to network, get to know each other, and hopefully build some lasting connections. And in that 450, we have 150 students here today, and I'm very proud of that. We have undergraduate students, we have students from other graduate programs across Rice, and so we welcome them here to Rice Business today. So a round of applause for the other students in the house. As conference organizers here, and in the spirit of capital discipline and value creation, we need to innovate and find ways to make this conference better every year. And so there's a few housekeeping things I do want to note off the bat, which are the first, our opening keynote by the Honorable Rob Kaplan will be live streamed, and that's intended to help make this conference a more national type of platform. That's what we want to do. The second is we are shifting to a digital Q&A platform, which is called Slido. I hope you all take a moment. The details of that are on the back of your name tag. So if you all have questions, please send them into Slido, and that will hopefully facilitate a more meaningful Q&A discussion. And the last is that we've repurposed our AFC in the back hallway there. That's now designed for networking. So we hope you all can take an opportunity to get to know each other and mingle and use that space and really have fun. So with that, I do just want to end by saying thank you to our attendees, our sponsors, and also thank you to all the alumni in the audience today. The alumni have been a huge resource to us, and so we thank them for their engagement too. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Rice Business Dean Peter Rodriguez. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and on behalf of everyone here at Rice University, and especially the Jones Graduate School of Business, I just want to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for being a part of today's conference. It is fantastically well run, and it is so well run because we have great students. And I just want to give additional thanks to Lucas. So if we could give a round of applause. He's worked nonstop, very long and hard. I don't know what his plans are for this afternoon, but I'm pretty sure a cocktail or a beer is going to go down real smooth after a year of planning this event and executing it with the precision they've done today. We have a great set of discussions on tap for today and a great set of topics to discuss, but none is more important and more valuable than hearing from our keynote, Rob Kaplan. Rob has been a great friend to the Jones School and Rice University, to Texas, and has, I think, the perfect background for a Fed governor. Really outstanding, and I think someone who adds a great deal to that body and to that group. I want to tell you a little bit about his bio, and then I'm going to introduce him. He's going to tell you a little bit about what he's been doing, which is fantastically important, some of the work of the Fed, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion and some Q&A through Slido, as Lucas mentioned earlier. So here's a bio, and I just want to say, I'm not going to, that's one reason we didn't read my bio, because I was going to read Rob's bio, and I didn't want any comparisons to this one. This is fantastic. So Rob has served as the 13th President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas since September 8, 2015. He represents the 11th Federal District on the Federal Open Market Committee in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy and oversees the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed, and as I understand, runs technology for the Fed as well. So this is an extraordinary job. He was previously the Martin Marshall Professor of Management Practice and a Senior Associate Dean at Harvard Business School, so someone extraordinarily familiar with the inner workings of a business school, with the MBA students and other students that we have here. He's the author of several books. I'll let you go and find them, but many of them that I think are really important, especially about becoming a great leader. Prior to joining Harvard in 2006, Rob was vice chairman of the Goldman Sachs Group with global responsibility for the firm's investment banking and investments management divisions. He became a partner in 1990 and served as co-chairman of the firm's partnership committee. He was also a member of the management committee. So as you can already see, that combination of skills of having a background on the street, having a background in academia, has made Rob a fantastic Fed governor. So following his 23-year career at Goldman Sachs, he became a senior director of the firm. He currently serves as chairman of Project ALS and is co-chairman of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, a global venture philanthropy firm that invests in developing nonprofit enterprises dedicated to addressing social issues. He's also a board member of the Harvard Medical School. He previously served on the boards of State Street Corporation, Harvard Management Company, Bed Bath & Beyond, and Heidrick & Struggles International. He was also a trustee of the Ford Foundation and co-founding board chair of the Teak Fellowship and others. Rob also comes to Texas. I don't know if he considers himself an honorary Texan. We consider him a Texan, but he was born and raised in Prairie Village, Kansas, received a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Kansas, and a Master's degree in Business Administration from Harvard Business School. Will you please all join me in giving a warm welcome to Rob Kaplan.
Thanks, Dean Rodriguez, and it's great to be at Rice, great to be at the Jones School of Business. And so what I'm going to talk about, I think we were going to do this, we've got about an hour, so I'm going to take maybe 20, 25 minutes, hopefully not more than that, and hit some key points. Then we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to take your questions. Just curious, how many students are here? Raise your hand. Business executives? And dumb question. From the energy industry? All right, okay, good. Figured that one out. Okay, good. So let me just comment a little bit. At the Dallas Fed, you may know, we do, obviously, we've got 1,300 employees. We've got 30 PhD economists. We do a lot of work on the economy, but we oversee payments in the United States. We supervise all the 650 banks in this district. We do big community outreach efforts, and the various Fed banks work together. And I'll also comment, for those of you who don't know, there's 12 Federal Reserve banks in the United States. We're the 11th district, and each of us, we get together formally every 6 weeks, 8 times a year in Washington. We just got done a few days ago, and we all meet together with the governors, and that's called the Federal Open Market Committee. And we usually meet for 3 days, and literally just got back Wednesday night. Today's the first day. We have a blackout period that always precedes the Federal Open Market Committee. This is the first day of the non-blackout period where I'm allowed to talk publicly. And I thought what I'd comment on is a little bit about the drivers of the U.S. economy. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our forecast, and then talk a little bit about energy. And so let's just start with this, and I'll comment now. The Dallas Fed, our forecast for 2019 is that growth in the United States is going to be a little bit better than 2%. Okay? That's what we think GDP, real GDP is going to be. The problem with that comment is first half growth in the United States was 2.5%. So if we're going to grow 2.1%, that's a nice way of saying we think growth in the second half of the year is going to be 1.7, 1.8. In other words, growth has decelerated, is decelerating during 2019. It's not a surprise. I've been saying, and our team has been saying now for the last year, year and a half, that we thought growth in 2019 would be slower. And by the way, it was 2.5% in 2018. Some of you may have thought it was higher, but with revisions, we grew 2.5% in 2018. But we thought growth in 2019 would be slower than 18, mainly because fiscal stimulus is waning, okay? And there's some structural reasons where we also felt that growth was likely to return to potential. And we think potential growth in the United States right now is in the neighborhood of 1.75% to 2%. And when a lot of people hear that, they gasp and say, my God, that I thought 2015, 2016 we were growing at 1.75% to 2%, and I thought we were going to grow a lot faster. And a lot of my time, and I'm going to comment in a moment, is explaining why potential growth in the United States is as low as it is. Now, if it makes you feel better, which it probably won't, potential growth in Japan has been declining, is now probably potential there is more like 0.5% or less. So let me talk a little bit about that. I'm a business person, not a PhD economist, so I tend to look at drivers. And let me just comment, there are 4 big drivers of the U.S. economy. And let me comment, and I've been talking about these for the last few years, but it helps explain why growth has been, and probably we think will continue to be somewhat disappointing versus what you remember from the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. Number 1 driver, population in the United States is aging, and the workforce growth as a result is slowing. People, yes, are working longer, but because of the sheer force of demographics, increasingly workers are aging out of the workforce. Why is this a big deal? GDP growth in a country is made up of growth in the workforce plus growth in productivity. And I'm telling you right now, we have a pretty good grip and expectation. Workforce growth here is slowing. It's going on, by the way, in most developed economies in the world. Germany has this problem much worse than the United States. Japan has it much worse. To not only is their workforce slowing, their overall population is expected to shrink, okay? Our population is expected to increase, but the rate of growth of the workforce is slowing to the point that we look at something called the labor force participation rate. Most of you have heard this term. It's the percentage of people in the economy, 16-year-olds and older, that are in the workforce. That means they're either employed or they're actively looking for work. In 2007, that percentage was about 66% in the United States. 66% of people 16 and above were either working or actively looking for work. Today, it's around 63%. We think at the Dallas Fed over the next 10 years, it's likely to move down to 61%. This is a very significant headwind for GDP growth. Now, country can do something about it. This is why there's been a lot of talk, and you may have heard, it helps explain why there's been a lot of talk on more child care benefits, which make it easier for people to get, and particularly women, to get into the workforce, so they have more child care availability. Transportation is a big issue, where there's some people, even if they were able to get back in the workforce, they can't afford transportation to get to work. And yes, as sensitive as it is, immigration historically has been a big part of workforce growth in the United States. To that point, and we do a lot of research on this at the Dallas Fed, it is our estimate that in excess of 50% of the workforce growth in the United States over the last 20 years is immigrants and their children, okay? And it gets better. For the next 20 years, it's our expectation that that number is going to be closer to 100%. How do I say that with such confidence? Because we know native-born workforce growth is going to be negative because of aging and because of demographics. So when you hear all this that way, it puts the immigration debate into somewhat different context. One last comment on immigration. We've done a lot of work at the Dallas Fed where we have openly recommended, and we meet with elected and appointed officials, both sides of the aisle, bipartisan, apolitical. Our research indicates that the U.S. would be very well served to restructure its immigration system to be more skills-based and employer-based, much more like Canada, where we go out and interview businesses, find out where the jobs are needed, and we backward integrate into our immigration. But the key, however you do it, and it's sensitive, the only other comment we make, if you believe you're going to cut the number of immigrants and grow GDP, the only point I make regularly is those two things do not go together, okay? And so, number one issue, slowing workforce growth. And we'll talk about more about this in the Q&A. Second issue, and I would call this technology and technology-enabled disruption combined with lagging education and skills training. So I mentioned GDP growth in a country is made up of growth in the workforce, which I just commented on, and growth in productivity. For those who watch this, one of the mysteries has been, with all this technology investment, productivity growth in the United States, the rate of productivity growth is decelerating, meaning it is more sluggish than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And if your workforce growth is slowing, you better make up for it by better productivity growth, and we're not. So what's going on? Particularly for those of you in business, and I'm a business person, every industry I look at is far more productive than it was 10 years ago. So is this a measurement thing? What the hell, what is this about? Here's what we think it's about at the Dallas Fed, and we've been working on this the last number of years, this theory, and we've done 2 conferences. We're about to do a 3rd. Businesses are investing more in technology to replace people. That's not new. It's been going on for most of our lives. What is new, probably because of distributed computing power, the consumer now has in the palm of his or her hand more computing power than a typical company did 10 or 15 years ago. And we go, oh yeah, like it's no big deal. It's a huge development. And what it means is disruptive platforms, and you can think of them because you use them every day. Disruptive platforms are emerging, often fueled with low-cost capital. Many of these businesses at this point not only don't make money, some of them don't even make a gross margin, okay? And they are disrupting businesses. What do I mean by disrupting? They're basically, for incumbent businesses, they don't have pricing power anymore. In fact, their prices are being pushed down. And you give me an example of an industry, I'll tell you a story of disruption. You could argue the shale boom was a disruptive technology to the energy business. And in the early days, when the incentives were, let's just drill, 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 that was phase one. And phase two is you got to make a return. And now we're in the capital discipline phase, as you talked about. And if you want to spend on CapEx, it's got to come out of cash flow. But this type of phenomena is going on in not every industry, but most every industry I look at. And those who don't think they're being affected, they should think again. Why does this matter? I'm not worried that businesses aren't going to be able to adapt to this. I think U.S. businesses are doing a terrific job, not without some pain, certainly, but are adapting to this trend. Now, listen, there'll be certain companies that will get disrupted out of existence, or will have much lower market caps. There'll be emerging disruptors. All that'll happen. Here's the issue, is its impact on the workforce. Businesses are doing a good job. Margins are high in the corporate world, even though this year corporate earnings are sluggish. But we find that the workforce is being affected by this in a very different way, depending on your educational attainment. If you've got a college education or greater in this country, while you may go through some trauma from disruption and technology-enabled disruption, you are likely through the course, highly likely through the course of your career to be in the workforce, and you're likely to see your earnings experience go like this, not without some fluctuations. On the other hand, if you're one of the 46 million workers in this country that have a high school education or less, this is out of a 160 million person workforce. If you're one of those 46 million, unless you have a skill, you are likely seeing your job being disrupted or eliminated, restructured or eliminated. Think of the call center worker that makes $55,000 a year with benefits, and I can tell you it's the expectation that most those jobs aren't going to exist 5 years from now. The impact of the driverless car on truck drivers and people who haul freight. And you can go on and on and on. And the problem is we are 25th out of 35 industrialized nations in math, science, and reading, so we're lagging in terms of education. What's the most important skill we believe you need to have to the advent of technology and artificial intelligence? Literacy, reading, ability to read and write and communicate. We are lagging in the United States. The statistics show it. Second, skills training is improving in junior colleges and high schools through the country, but not nearly fast enough to keep up with this trend of technology and technology-enabled disruption. So the so-called skills gap, have you heard that term? This is half of all small businesses in this country say they cannot find skilled workers, and the gap is growing. And so the impact of this is we measure productivity workforce-wide, and certain segments of the population are maybe even thriving in this kind of environment, but it's heavily based on education. And there's another meaningful segment that is actually seeing capitalism not working so well for them, and it has to do with the fact they may have lower educational attainment, and it is not as culturally, we're not as used to and not set up to get these people retrained so they can get back into the workforce. And so because we think this is one of the big reasons why productivity growth is sluggish. What to do about it? We spend an enormous amount of time, as many of you know me, at the Dallas Fed, working with school districts, with the governors and lieutenant governor of the state on education reform. We think the whole ecosystem needs to be upgraded. Early childhood literacy, expanded pre-K, better college readiness, and many more kids that are going to college probably would be better served to go for skills training first, get a middle-class job nailed down. And by the way, we're improving, and Texas is doing a good job, probably better than most states, but if technology-enabled disruption is going like this, the improvement in education and skills training improving like this. And the gap is widening, which is why we have rising income, wealth inequality. But this lowers GDP growth. What's the highest return? When I'm asked, what's the highest return on equity investment we could make in this state, in this country? Early childhood literacy. Make sure more kids are starting first grade at grade level. Improve skills training. And we're not investing enough, and we're not even talking about enough investing more in our human capital. So these are two big reasons why we think GDP growth is sluggish. Quickly, two last big drivers. Third big driver is globalization. Now, you may say, well, I mean, that's not new, and in fact, it may be going a different direction right now, but globalization in terms of integrated economies, integrated businesses, 45% today of the S&P 500 has revenues outside the United States. It is our judgment that, for example, the trade relationship with Mexico, which I'll talk more about in the Q&A if you would like, that's a good example of a relationship which is highly based on integrated supply chains and logistics, to the point where 40% of U.S. imports from Mexico is U.S. content. Okay? It is our research at the Dallas Fed that that type of trading relationship, even though there's a deficit, allows the U.S. to grow jobs, domicile here, and we were taking share or had been taking share from the rest of the world, particularly Asia, because it makes U.S. companies more competitive. But globalization, so, is not just about integrated economies, integrated businesses, it's about integrated supply chains and logistics. And I don't need to tell those of you in the energy business, for those who don't think trade matters, one of the big reasons why we think global growth is decelerating is because it's highly correlated to trade deceleration. Global trade is decelerating. Global growth is decelerating. While trade is important to the United States, it's over 40% of German GDP. Okay? It's over 20% of Asian GDP. And one of the reasons why, I don't need to tell you, we believe strongly that the price of oil is somewhat depressed is diminished expectations of global growth. And the energy business is a classic example of, for those who think, global growth doesn't matter to the United States, we're very well insulated, it's only 12 or 13% of U.S. GDP, exports are. It's having a direct effect on the energy business, but that's true of many other industries. This is a second order and third order effect. The point is, if the U.S. is less than 5% of the world's population, we believe at the Dallas Fed that globalization is an opportunity for this country. Okay? That could be through appropriate immigration and immigration reform, through trade. And the reason I mention this, today, the narrative in the United States has been very much, if you've lost your job or your job is being restructured or eliminated, it is probably due to globalization. Lousy trade deal, maybe immigration. And our own research at the Dallas Fed suggests that that probably might have been true 15 or 20 years ago, though. Today, if your job is being disrupted or eliminated in the United States, we think it's highly probable that it is due to technology and technology-enabled disruption probably going on within the United States. And the reason we flag this, if we get that diagnosis wrong, we are likely to make poor policy decisions which will cause us to grow more slowly. In a country where the population is aging, workforce growth is slowing, productivity is sluggish because we haven't invested enough in our human capital, I hope we'll fix that. Trade is an opportunity to help supplement growth, and obviously trade is, and globalization generally, is a challenge. Fourth big trend, none of all this would matter that much, by the way, if we weren't so darn highly leveraged. Okay? So the household sector over the last 10 years has this is good news, has been deleveraging. Not because they've reduced debt so much, but they haven't increased debt and incomes have gone up, so the household sector is in better shape and the job market, I don't need to tell you, is very tight. Great. Corporate debt outside the financial sector is at a record high. And I've spoken publicly, I'm concerned about it, and I'm concerned that it could be an amplifier of a downturn. And I've also said publicly, I'm very worried about what could happen is you could have 2 or 3 sizable BBB credits get downgraded to BB or single B, and the single B or BB markets aren't big and liquid enough to tolerate, accept those downgrades, and you might have a spread widening, which could cause a sudden tightening in financial conditions. So I think this issue may be manageable, but it's one I'm watching. But there's a third sector that is dramatically more leveraged, and that's the government sector. Debt held by the public is now 77% of GDP, and the present value of unfunded entitlements is something in the neighborhood of $58 or $59 trillion. Okay? And the only reason we don't scream about this every day is we've gotten used to the idea that the dollar is the world's reserve currency and people globally have just got to be overweight dollars. We think at the Dallas Fed it is dangerous to rest our future on that presumption, which we think will be the case for a number of years and hopefully for the foreseeable future. But our point is we think the growth in debt and debt to GDP at the government level is likely not sustainable. And why? So why does all the first three things matter? So how do you improve it? One, yes, you could do entitlement reform, very tricky politically, but in other ways, you got to grow faster, grow the workforce, improve productivity. Opportunities presented by globalization are essential, have never been more essential because we are so highly leveraged now at the government level. And that, by the way, every day we grow at 1 3/4 to 2%, debt to GDP just goes north. And I'm just trying to cheer you up to start your day here. I could talk also about climate change, other structural drivers, but these are the big drivers, and I will in the Q&A because it's now affecting most businesses we talk to. It certainly affects the energy business. I think it surprises people outside Texas to know that many energy companies are at the forefront of some of the activities to try to address climate change, but we'll come back to that. And certainly it affects the strategic plans of most community leaders and civic leaders and mayors in this state, particularly along the Gulf and in Houston and other parts. But my point is, these structural drivers help explain why potential GDP growth has gone from a much higher number 10 years ago to lower today. And I like to talk about these structural drivers, even though, by the way, none of them have anything to do with monetary policy, because I think it's part of our job at the Fed to call out these issues for elected and appointed officials, local, state, federal, both sides of the aisle, because it's going to take broader economic policy, I think, than just monetary policy if we're going to grow faster and address some of these issues. And I might stop there. We could talk a lot about, I'm sure you'll ask about why do we lower rates and monetary policy and all that, but you want to just do it in the Q&A? You want to stop? We'll stop there. I think I've used about 20 minutes, so let me stop, and we'll go to Q&A and I'll talk about the rest of it. Oh, yes.
Rob, thank you. That's fantastic. We wish we had 3 hours for that. It was a little sad in parts, but most of it was absolutely fascinating. And the breadth of the issues and how salient they are, you know, it's interesting that even in a strong economy, so we had a good jobs report today,
right.
All sorts of things, there are a lot of big issues that don't seem to be getting enough attention. And I wanted to start with one, but we could go back and forth. I'm going to paraphrase something I heard that I think is almost right. It's something that's near and dear to me, is that it's about the skills gap challenge. And it was about Harris County and the surrounding school districts, and the number was startling. It was that 4 out of 5 high school graduates received no post-secondary certification. So no junior college degree, no college degree. And that's not the be-all, end-all of skills attainment, but it's a startlingly low number. And so what I wanted to have you expand a little bit more on is what can we do about this skills gap challenge? Where are we falling short, and how do you think we need to spend our effort in a policy framework, but also maybe in a secular way, addressing skills gap issues?
So let me just explain one point on this is, how do we miss this? Given this doesn't just happen. What's happened over the last, based on our work in the last 20, 25 years, there's so-called middle skills jobs, okay? And something like, the percentages vary, but something like 45% of all jobs in the United States are referred to in the lingo as middle skills jobs. You know, registered nurses, IT specialists, automotive technicians, you go on and on and on and on. People who drive boats, the barges in the Gulf. What's changed based on the work we've done is a much higher percentage of those jobs require more training and certifications than they did 20 years ago. Okay, so as a good example, registered nurse, we've always known that's a certification, but many more of these other jobs require certifications. The education system hasn't set up to provide it, and the other thing, you know, we do these meetings with workforce development boards and business leaders all around the state, and we ask, why aren't we doing more of this? We're improving. What's the biggest impediment? One, it has to be done locally. In other words, this can't be done from DC. Worker mobility is historically low, so if you're gonna create skills training, it means local businesses team with local junior college presidents and probably high school superintendents and agree we're gonna form a partnership. And we're doing a good job in Texas doing that, but in the United States, a lot of junior college presidents and other education leaders haven't adapted. They think we push curriculum. They don't go out and interview businesses. And so it's a change in what the job is, even of a high school superintendent these days and a junior college superintendent. And once you get it right in a few cities and towns, how do you spread that practice all through the United States? We've been sluggish at doing that. And then the other thing is culturally, most people don't want their children to grow up and do one of these middle skills jobs. But one of the reasons we've talked about is they don't realize how much money they make. Yeah. These are middle-class jobs. They're highly paid. Based on our work, automotive technician makes $125,000, $150,000 a year. Most people don't know that.
Don't say that to the MBAs.
Yeah, sorry. But culturally, there's a lack of awareness, and what we're finding is when I visit these skills training centers, a lot of the students there intend to go on and do college, but they're getting a bedrock career first. So we've got a lot of work to do. Texas, actually, felt pretty good vis-a-vis the rest of the United States is probably doing a good job just about any state. But I would say the performance on this is really uneven in the United States. We are lagging, and yet for businesses, this trend, they're not lagging. This is going like this.
Right, so it's really interesting because this issue of productivity growth links back to the skills gap challenge, and you talked about that in the way you discussed the four big changes or the four big drivers this morning. The other one that's sort of related to that is that complements that is this issue of demographic change, sort of the aging out of a domestic workforce and the reliance, or what you said would be a really strong reliance on immigration going forward and the challenges there. So can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on how a skills-based immigration system might work, or how we might implement that?
So always a little careful not to be too expansive on this, because this is an understatement, politically sensitive. So one of the reasons the Dallas Fed has a lot of credibility on this, we stay away from a lot of these political debates. But P. Arrhenius, who's a senior economist at the Dallas Fed, has spent years doing this research. And we've spent a lot of time studying Canada. They have what's called a point system there. And what they do is they go out literally and survey businesses all through the country. And they also survey professions and see where there's a gap. And they factor that into their immigration. So what's an example? The United States has been renowned for decades. You talk about distinctive competence. One of the distinctive competencies of the United States for a long time is we've been a magnet for talent. Our universities have been a magnet for talent, okay? A lot of people from around the world are not coming here, and some feel that they're either they're not as comfortable coming, or they feel they've been discouraged from coming. Our own research would suggest if we had more of this kind of point system analysis, we might change which things we're suppressing, and we might be stimulating other things that we're currently suppressing. But we're recommending, and by the way, people on both sides of the aisle, we meet people on both sides, highly receptive. It's hard to have a meeting with an elected official or point who doesn't agree with this. They just don't know how to get it done. But we're not being as strategic as we ought to be about the way we're doing immigration.
Well, thank you for mentioning it. I speak about it in part because it's such a salient issue at all colleges and universities, and particularly here. You see a great shortage of availability of H-1B visas, even in areas where job demand is high, where needs are high and where there are a very high proportion of skills in the immigrant population that we can attract. But you've seen a real chill in recent years, and it's not just at our school, but it's around the universities, and it's a big issue for us.
I'll mention one other thing because it's so glaring. So there's the middle skills gap, which we've talked about, but I got to tell you, every meeting now I'm in with business leaders, go to Corpus Christi, talk to technology companies, can't find engineers, can't get them, and so they're competing for them. They're willing to pay them. We don't seem to be producing enough of them. Immigration was a part of that puzzle, not the only part, but it is limiting the growth of a lot of businesses I talk to who say we just can't fill these engineering jobs, and it's slowing some of our expansion plans.
And on the one hand, that's great for all the people who are engineers and have the jobs, but it really is going to show up in productivity and job growth.
Just means lower GDP, lower growth.
Well, that sends the real good message there. You know, what's interesting, just as a theme, and I've heard this in a few of your conversations, is you do spend a lot of your time talking about fiscal policy issues and structural issues as the key drivers. And the Fed, of course, is monetary policy. But how do you make that? But that's a hard thing to do, I would imagine.
So here's why, and we are careful would be an understatement. And I probably talk about these issues more than any other person at the Federal Open Market Committee, but I made a decision. I come from the private sector, and if I'm going to leave the private sector to do this job, as I'm here, we're talking a lot about negative rates in Japan, negative rates in Europe, central banks taking extraordinary action, and my own reaction to what I see in monetary policy around the world. The lesson for me is not to follow them. The lesson is we need broader economic policy. Through most of our lifetimes, people in this room, we had monetary policy, and there wasn't a lot even written about the Fed for a number of years, right? Before the crisis.
The whole idea was to keep it secret.
Yeah, it's like a referee in a game. If you have to talk about them, it must be a big problem. And we had fiscal policy, structural reforms. We had a broad range of policies. In the last 10 years, the Fed is and central banks around the world have stepped center stage, and we're starting to get used to the idea, if there's an economic problem, what are you going to do? But what's the central bank going to do? And I feel a big part of my job is to flag, actually it's not supposed to be that way. And obviously I'm a central banker, so I'd like to think what we do is important, but you also have to articulate more of the limitations of monetary policy. And I'll put a finer point on it. What's monetary policy? We have a dual mandate, full employment and price stability, but another way to say it is our job, in my opinion, if we're growing at or below potential, at or below our potential, means that monetary policy should be on the margin accommodative, okay? And you've seen the moves we've made in the last number of months, and I've been in favor of making, is to try to ensure that we grow at or above potential. But if you don't like potential, if you're disappointed that potential is like 1 3/4, 2%, that's not monetary policy. All these other policies are what get you above potential. And oh, by the way, if we don't change some of these non-monetary policies, our forecasts at the Dallas Fed, at least, of potential GDP growth in the United States are this. In other words, if it's 1 3/4 to 2% today, it'll be something like 1.5 to 1 3/4 5 years from now. This is eroding. We can fix it, but it starts with talking about it. I used to be a university professor for 10 years, and I learned if you're not talking about it, you don't have much of a chance to solve it. You got to frame the issue, and we think at the Dallas Fed, it's a big part of our job is to flag these issues and frame it in an apolitical way based on research. So that's why we do it.
So that's really helpful, and it does sort of tie together the 4 points you made today, that potential GDP, if we don't do something about the demographic issues and immigration, about technology-enabled skills disruption and mitigating that in the secular world, manage globalization and get a wrangle on corporate debt, then really the potential isn't high, and there's not much you can do about monetary policy.
And oh, by the way, I'll add on, we think we're about $3 trillion underinvested in infrastructure in the United States.
That's a
I
big
would say
number.
China's probably $3 trillion overinvested in infrastructure. We're probably $3 trillion underinvested. And for those who want to know what I'm talking about, think the port, the ports along the Gulf here and the work they need and people are crying out for. And a lot of this can be done with private money. It doesn't have to be government money, but we think that's also part of the puzzle here.
But $3 trillion is a big number. That's 15 to 20% of GDP, or getting into maybe 10, it's a big, big number.
It's a big number, but it's an investment.
It's an investment, even though we have a very large debt level at the federal level. And
so that's one of the things we also talk about, and this is a sensitive subject, but if we did an analysis of the corporate tax reform passed in a couple, 3 years ago, there were 3 parts. It was corporate tax reform, which we actually think still will yield benefits, but the trade uncertainty is probably muted. It's muted business investment. Business investment is weak, but we think corporate tax reform would probably be, over the years, helpful. But there was, in addition, a big individual tax cut and a very large bipartisan spending bill. The problem is they were not investment oriented, and our own analysis at the time was that those 2 parts of the bill were likely to cause a bump, they would wane, and we would return back down to potential, and that's basically what's happened. We view infrastructure spending as a little bit different.
well, it sounds like something everybody around here can appreciate and thinks is vital, particularly around the port, but the physical infrastructure all around cities and the ones that connect our cities are important. We're going to turn to some questions that have been sourced from the audience here in a moment, but I wanted to ask you something, just a little about the inside game, if you don't mind. I mentioned earlier your background is so perfect in my mind for the Fed, but how do you go about preparing yourself for an FOMC meeting? I mean, that sounds like the big game. It sounds like a moment where you can make your points and bring your particular perspective. What goes into your prep?
So so I mentioned we got 30 PhD economists at the Dallas Fed, but we talk to economists all over the country and sometimes the world to get opposing views and alternative views. So we've got all economic work. We do surveys of hundreds of companies in the 11th district, and just to remind you, we have over 50 Fortune 500 companies in this district. You know, this district is approaching 10% of U.S. GDP, so we've got a great ecosystem here. I personally talk to about 30 CEOs a month, believe it or not, or usually every 4 to 6 weeks period, and we pre-schedule calls basically to understand what's going on. And then I travel all over the district and are meeting with business leaders all through the district, and I ask lots and lots of questions.
Big district, too.
So it's a big district, yes. And so that's a nice way of saying part of this is analysis, part of it is quantitative, looking at data, and part of it is feel. I'd say I'm similar to most FOMC, most presidents around the system. You know, I'm always preparing for the Federal Open Market Committee. I'm always thinking about, and I mean 7 days a week when watching a football game, whatever, I'm thinking about what do I think is going on in the economy. But we intensively prepare in the 2 weeks leading up to FOMC. And people walk into that room, for lack of a better word, loaded for bear, meaning we're prepared. And so when I go into that room, we each have about 10 minutes of airtime to give our analysis of the U.S. economy. Jay Powell goes last, gives his 10-minute analysis. We listen to each other. I'm trying to add insight to them. They're trying to, and I learn back in turn from them. I always change my mind on certain things from that meeting. So the setup of the Fed, for me, as someone who's only been here 4 years, it's pretty powerful in that it's a great learning organization. And the most important things that can come out of my mouth most of the time are, I don't know, I'd like your advice, I've changed my mind, I was wrong, and I've learned in this job you better be open to that because it's a very complicated thing to try to understand the U.S. economy.
Fantastic. Well, this has been extraordinarily helpful. I'm now going to use our audience to get some questions, and it won't surprise you that a fair number of them are about the energy sector. So if we could get a little more depth on your prediction for the energy sector here in Texas and the United States, and just to preload it, there are also questions about politics in the energy sector in the upcoming election. So anything on that sensitive or easy topic?
Yeah,
you have at it.
So let me give a couple of comments. We have a big energy group at the Dallas Fed, and we spent a lot of time on this. And we get a lot of the views I'm about to give you are informed by a broad group of energy executives across this district and to some extent across the nation who are either on our boards or we have an energy advisory group. And so that really is essential to our views. And the long and short of it is this. When I got into this job in 2015, fall of 15, it was clear we were in a global oversupply situation. I don't need to tell you guys this. And that lasted through 15, through 16, somewhere into 17 and maybe early parts of 18. It struck us that we were getting in the neighborhood of global supply-demand balance. Now, that's a dangerous statement to make because you've got the Iraq situation, you got the Venezuela situation, Libya outages at any point in time. But what struck us and strikes us today is a lot of the problems that the industry is facing. We think it's always about supply and demand, but this current situation has a lot to do with demand. And global growth is decelerating. A big part of why it's decelerating is trade uncertainty, which I talked through earlier. It affects the U.S., but it has a dramatic effect. There's a very high correlation between the flow of global trade and global growth, and there's sand in the gears right now of the global trading system. And I'm not sure that's going to change anytime soon. We may have a kind of hiatus or stabilization, but it's possible that some of these tariffs, or a substantial portion, it may not get worse, but they may stay on for a number of years. So we're monitoring this very, very carefully. What the impact of that is, net production growth from the United States was about 1.8, 1.9 million barrels a day in 2018. We think net production growth this year in the U.S. will be something like net about 800,000. And we think next year it's likely to be 500,000 or below. So to disentangle that, the decline curve of shale is dramatic, as much as 70% or more in the first year. Most companies, with some exceptions, are not making long-lived investments in these big-ticket infrastructure projects, production projects. And so because of the emphasis on capital discipline, funding CapEx out of cash flow, everything we see, and from our context, CapEx is dramatically down, and people are finishing existing wells, the DUCs, but they're not putting a lot of money in to new wells. And even after the Saudi attack, which created a 5.7 million outage,
Seems like nothing happened after that.
It's right. Well, the Saudis said right after it that they thought they could replace it. They didn't explain exactly how. And as we sit here today, it looks like they replaced it. And by the way, there's not complete clarity on exactly how. Some repairs, some restoring production, some from reserves. But the long and short of it, the price today is lower by a couple, $3 than before the attack, based on our measure. And the long and short of it is we think net production growth in the United States is going to trend down as long as this global growth deceleration continues. If I look, last comment, if I look out ahead, though, 5 or 10 years, it is our view, and has been our view for some time, while it's going to be rocky in the interim, and there's going to be mergers, restructurings. If you're leveraged in this industry, it's going to be very challenging. It is highly likely over the next 5 or 10 years that we could be in a global undersupply situation, because shale by itself, and the U.S. being the marginal producer, will not be sufficient to keep up with global demand growth, particularly if you have some more moderation, improvement in global growth, which we think eventually we're going to have. So the long-term prospects for the industry are better than they feel right now, unless you're leveraged.
That's good.
Yeah, I think they are. I think the longer-term prospects for the industry are better because of the constraints on shale production and how hard it is to grow, and the fact that global demand is decelerating, but a lot of it's going to depend on what happens in the years ahead, particularly with trade and how that interacts with global growth.
So you've got on the demand side, trade uncertainty, diminishing growth prospects, which is bad for oil prices and other energy prices. And on the other hand, the facility with which you can stand down wells and shale and a lack of capex will lead to a supply correction that will over the short term.
Listen, I talk to energy CEOs, shale CEOs a lot. This is an industry where the one comment they make to me regularly, shale is a lot more challenging than people may have thought 3 to 5 years ago, and scale, and running it more like you've heard this, a manufacturing process, I think people realize a lot more important than may have been understood certainly 3 to 5 years ago.
So I have a related question here. It says, some political candidates have suggested if elected they would dampen shale drilling. How important is the next election to the outcome to GDP and the energy industry?
So while there might be press quotes from me on a number of things out of this meeting, you're not going to see a press quote from me on that. because I'm not going to comment on that. I don't think it's appropriate for me to. Other than to say what I just explained.
You just got rid of about 90% of our questions.
If you believe we're in global supply-demand balance. I know people think, gee, we're over, we're under because of what you think is going to happen to demand and outages and waivers and sanctions and all that. If you had a big outage, doesn't have to be here, but somewhere in the world, that could not be where there isn't a prospect of it being restored, that could cause an immediate spike in the price of energy, and that has a big effect on the consumer in the United States. So these are all factors that have to be looked at, but I'll stay away from it other than to talk about supply, demand, and the dynamics of the industry.
So that's excellent. This is not your first public comment on it. That's fantastic. So on a related question, but maybe you can speak about this slightly differently, how do you think about climate impacts in the long term for the U.S. economy?
So I just wrote, and we just wrote in my a lengthy essay on climate change. And so just to give you a little sense, central bankers have not historically talked as much about this subject. The Bank of England has talked extensively about it, but in the context of financial stability, i.e., you know, if you have climate events, what's the impact on the insurance industry? What's the impact on banks? And we look at that, but I'm finding, and we're finding, living here in the state of Texas and in the 11th District, that the subject of, you can't go through a week or even a couple of days here without the subject of climate change coming up with either a CEO, a mayor, a public official. Why? Because we house a good part of the nation's petrochemical and refinery infrastructure along the Gulf. We're very vulnerable to climate events. We did an extensive analysis, which we published. If you want to look at the Dallas Fed website, we did an extensive analysis of the National Climate Assessment, which is the assessment done most recently by a consortium of government agencies. And what they predict, we don't make predictions at the Dallas Fed, but we certainly read what they write. It is their view that average temperatures are going to continue to rise, water levels around the world are going to rise. The intensity and even frequency of severe weather events, hurricane defined as 74 miles an hour and above, is going to increase. The implications mean for the state of Texas and for the 11th District, you're going to have more flooding, you're going to have more severe weather events, you could have more drought, it'll affect migration patterns, it'll affect the viability of the ports and the infrastructure investment that needs to be made in the billions. It'll affect investments that need to be made to protect petrochemicals and refineries. And it's unusual today to talk to a big energy company that isn't actively working, this is our conversations, on wind or solar. We're the largest wind producing state in the country, by the way, you may know that. And it's unusual to talk to a company, including a supplier to the energy business, that does not tell me they're actively working on greenhouse gas emissions target, sequestration, and how to, in the lingo, reduce the greenhouse gas emission intensity of their production. Not to mention the impact on water, you know, the sand impact and everything else. So this is a big topic in the 11th District, and the reason we wrote it is that in conjunction with California and the San Francisco Fed, where they've got all the issues with fires that you're seeing about today and severe weather events. We think the danger for the United States, right now these are thought as tail events. Harvey estimated cost plus or minus $75 billion. If these tail events start to happen with frequency, they're no longer tail events, and they actually will start to impact GDP. Our own view is the commercial opportunity for the country to address these issues is great. In other words, there's a lot of commercial opportunity to address this, but we're going to need to, because these tail events are happening with greater frequency, and they ultimately are going to have some more impactful impact on our assessment of GDP capacity for the United States.
Well, it's a major topic here when we think about the Ike Dike and other infrastructure and investments that are needed to protect the ports. On a related topic, we have a question here that is about carbon capture and carbon taxes. It says, carbon capture is a major topic of discussion. Do you think that a carbon tax or a emission trading framework is feasible in this economy, and do you expect one?
Yeah, so for me, that's a little bit too, it's a politically sensitive issue, but I will say we just had down to the 11th district separately Greg Mankiw, who is a senior economist at Harvard, used to be
president of the CEA.
He used to be exactly head of the CEA, and we just had Glenn Hubbard down. And one thing they both agree on, and we just had Hank Paulson down a little bit before that, one thing they all agree on, they all are proposing this idea and have done a lot of analysis on it.
The carbon tax idea.
Jim Baker, we've met with, is also proposing this idea. I think it's appropriate for me at the Dallas Fed to stay away from weighing in on that, other than to acknowledge this is being actively discussed, and in some cases being discussed by people that I think might surprise people who's proposing it.
Right, so just, and that makes sense. So all three of those gentlemen that you mentioned, I think, served in Republican administrations, I believe, as either President, Secretary of State, of course, and the Treasury, and then two presidents of the Council of Economic Advisors, Hubbard and Mankiw. So maybe a related question to that might be, if you had to look forward and ask yourself, how long do you see fossil fuels playing a majority role in the energy supply mix in the U.S.? Is there a long tail estimate of that?
So we've done analysis on this, and we've worked with the international agencies, energy agencies, and their best estimate is, I think the last I saw, by the year, I believe it was by the year 2050, this may not be exactly right, their estimate was something like still 75%. This is with aggressive growth in alternatives. Their estimate was that 75% of world energy consumption will be fossil fuel related. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I'm sure it will continue to be updated, but the point that struck us is whatever the percentage is, it's likely for probably the rest of at least the foreseeable future, fossil fuels are going to be a significant percentage of global energy consumption and production.
That's a good one. We're just going to put that right on the website. That's great. We have a couple of questions we have a couple of questions that are related to interest rates, and of course, coming off of an FOMC meeting, this is valuable. But this is probably a question you get something like a lot. So historically, when output is at potential, this is the question, and inflation is around 2% and unemployment lower than 4%, why do you cut rates?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So here's what I think's been going on here. I would call, if I had to give an adjective to describe the economy we've had in 2019, I would use the word mixed. And what do I mean? Global growth is decelerating, and it is my view and our view at the Dallas Fed, the U.S. is not immune to global growth decelerating. I don't need to tell you in the energy business that's an example of that, but you're not the only example. So that's one issue. Second, manufacturing is weaker in the United States than it's been in 10 years. Okay. Thirdly, business fixed investment, including the most recent GDP report, is very disappointing, is very sluggish. Now, there's some reasons for that, but the good news is the consumer in the United States, which is approximately 70% of the economy, is strong. Why are they strong? I mentioned consumer balance sheets are in better shape, household balance sheets are in better shape, and the job market is tight. And so I will tell you, if I knew that the consumer would stay strong, I would tell you we're going to have solid, I don't know what the growth rate will be, but we'll have solid growth. My concern has been, does global growth deceleration, mainly due to trade uncertainty, weak manufacturing, weak business investment, ultimately seep into other parts of the economy to where all of a sudden it catches up with the jobs market, and ultimately consumer confidence, which can be a fragile thing, becomes more muted or negative, and we have a more severe slowing. It's been my judgment, and this is a judgment call based on all the sources I use, that if we wait to see the consumer weakness, if we did nothing and waited until we see consumer weakness, I'm pretty confident we've waited too long. And what do I mean by that? All the ammunition we have will not be enough to arrest that slowdown. Okay? So I felt strongly from a risk management point of view, and maybe affected a little bit by my business background, if you know your ammunition is historically a little bit low, if you see signs of weakness, I'd rather use some of it now when it matters, and that means July, September, and this most recent meeting, where we can maybe moderate that slowing and avoid a more severe downturn. I felt strongly from a risk management point of view that was prudent. I would also say to you today, though, having made those 3 moves and having supported those 3 moves, it is my judgment that monetary policy is now basically appropriate, at an appropriate level, and I would strongly advocate that we are patient from here and allow time for the economy to develop and unfold. Monetary policy acts with a lag, meaning the moves we made in July, September, October, it usually takes, there's no precise answer, it's at least 6 to 12 months for those to feed through the economy. I felt strongly we should act. We have acted. I think the appropriate thing to do now with the Fed funds rate at 1.5 to 1 3/4 is to be patient and allow some time to unfold. And I think the setting of monetary policy today is roughly appropriate based on my outlook for the economy.
That's very clear. Thank you. And that makes a lot of sense. I hear you saying that if you wait too long, it's too late, and you have to act on what your expectations are for future consumer behavior, and that's a big worry for us. So, a related question about interest rates. So I'm sure you guys get all the sides all the time. So this is one of the questions, which would be, if you have interest rates too low, don't you just facilitate the lingering success of marginal businesses? Wouldn't higher interest rates force more discipline in underperforming businesses to fail? That's a question.
I think some of that is going on. And so let me also put it in context, though. So most businesses out there, especially large businesses, borrow, some people borrow floating rate. Some auto loans are floating rate. There are other types of loans that are floating rate. But a lot of business loans are actually term loans that are with a fixed rate, okay? And I'll just remind you, the 10-year Treasury in November of 2018, you probably don't, it seems like 10 years ago, but it was just a year ago, was 3.25. The 10-year Treasury today is 1.70, plus or minus. In other words, we've had a 150 basis point rally in the 10-year. From November to November, the Fed has not moved anywhere. It's made net, I think the Fed funds rate is 50 basis points lower. So what's my point? What's happened since November of last year is expectations of future growth have become more pessimistic. I think there are several reasons. One of them is trade tensions have dramatically escalated, particularly starting in April. A lot of this reduction in the 10-year has happened since April, where trade tensions really intensified. The Mexico threat, which people forget about, was probably of the things that happened one of the most significant, where even though it didn't happen, it made businesses here feel like the uncertainty was much higher and the threat of tariffs out of the blue was much higher than they might have thought. Anyhow, the point of it is a lot of the incentives to borrow more occurred away from the Fed. They had to do with expectations of growth slowing. Our expectations of growth at the Dallas Fed slowed because of that uncertainty. And so the Fed making moves has a little bit caught up, not all the way, but caught up to that slowing. And the one thing I was worried about, last comment, you heard a lot about the yield curve inversion. Right. We went through several months where the Fed funds rate was above every rate along the curve, including the 30-year. As a former markets person, I'm still a markets person, to me, when the Fed funds rate is above the entire Treasury curve, that is a message to me, a reality check, that the Fed funds setting is too tight. And so it's not perfect, but with the Fed funds rate at 1.5 to 1 3/4, the 10-year today at 170, the 2-year at 155, the 5-year at 152, let's say, it's not perfect, but I feel much better that there's a more normal shape to the yield curve. Why does that matter to me? It matters to me because if you can't borrow short and lend long, with an inversion, history has shown me and has shown when we've looked at over the last 50 years, you may not have immediate tightening, but within a year or so, you're going to have a tightening in financial conditions, which in turn will slow the economy. And by acting, one of the things I wanted to do is to try to address that.
No, that makes great sense, and it's a very good question. We talk about those topics in our courses a lot, so that's valuable. I have one last question, which is just be the topic of about the last 6 I see here. I took it from your comments, or it seems to be taken from your comments, that there's really not a real bright spot around the global economy of high growth. Is that a fair statement? Do you see slowing in Europe and in China and other places?
So the bright spots around the world, there are better demographic profiles in emerging market countries, and not all of them, but a number of them in the United States. I think that's an opportunity. I think there's terrific business opportunities around the world. By the way, climate change is probably one of them. I think right now the global growth potential is being a little bit muted because for a lot of reasons, but uncertainty and particularly trade uncertainty. So I'm optimistic that if we can get some stability and reduce that uncertainty, you're going to see better investment, more opportunities to take advantage of these global opportunities. But I do think a lot of these structural issues we talked about at the early part, we would grow faster, not just here, but I think our prospects around the world would be better if we addressed a number of these structural issues. I'm optimistic because it's so critical to the future of the United States. I'm optimistic that we're going to do that. And oh, by the way, another minor optimism, I'm optimistic that in the next 6 months you'll probably get a passing of the USMCA, and that by itself is not the be-all, end-all, but it gets one of these uncertainties. If we can whittle away at some of these uncertainties, I think there's a lot of investment potential and business investment that is waiting and hasn't canceled project, but is on hold, that I think we might see. You could see a burst of business investment down the road, but we need less uncertainty, less unpredictability.
That's a great point on which to end. Rob, this has been terrific. I speak honestly when I say I could do this all day, but we have to let other people talk. But thank you very much.
Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you to the Dallas Fed for all their support.
Great, thanks everyone. We're just going to change the stage around real quickly and then be back in a couple minutes. Thanks.
Julian, if you want to come right over here.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want me to hold any of your stuff while
You want to just, yes, absolutely.
you can also just leave it on that table.
I'll just leave
and
it.
grab it.
That's fine.
That works.
And this cup is actually done, but still
Okay,
liquid.
I got it.
Looking for me, I'm sorry. I was sitting in listening. So, trying to figure out the global economy. Did I miss anything? Is there any last minute update?
No.
I'm just going to look at you. What?